So onto this spectacular panel. I think it'll be one of the highlights of the convention. The title of the panel is Black and Blue, Cartooning Black Lives Matter and Modern Policing. It's drawing on the issues of police brutality, race, and social justice. It's featuring cartoonists Keith Knight and Darrin Bell with North Carolina Senator Mike Woodard, moderated by Duke Law Professor Jim Coleman, Director of the Center for Criminal Justice and Professional Responsibility. This is presented in partnership with the Center for Multicultural Affairs, Black Student Alliance, and Duke NAACP. Darrin Bell is the creator of the comic strip Candorville and the recipient of the RFK Award for Social Justice and Human Rights. Keith Knight is known for his provocative feature, K Chronicles, and is a leading cartoonist on social justice issues. Let's welcome Keith.
I'll get booed.
And State Senator Mike Woodard will give his unique government perspective on the issue and can help round out the discussion. Welcome. So everyone welcome our moderator, Jim Coleman, Duke Law Professor, and he'll take the discussion from here.
I'll just stand and start it, and then I'll sit. Well, it's great to see all of you here. Like the senator, I'm also not a cartoonist. Although when I was in college and then early in my career in Washington, I was an avid fan of Pat Oliphant and his little penguin, Punk, and then her block in the Washington Post. I looked forward every time their panel appeared in the newspaper. It's somewhat unfortunate that I think my students have no idea for the most part, what political cartoons are and how powerful they can be. So I hope that some students at least are coming and catching some of these discussions. These are truly amazing individuals and the impact that they can have on issues. And this is probably a very interesting time in North Carolina to be having this discussion. The format that we're going to have is that Keith and Darrin will each talk for about 10 minutes. And then Senator Woodard will speak. And then I'll give each of them an opportunity to comment on something that the other panelists said. And then at that point, I will open it for your questions. And I hope you will have questions that will get us through the time that we would have remaining. So without further ado, we'll begin with Darrin, and then Mike, and then Senator Woodard.
Well, let's look at some cartoons. Question I get all the time is, why do I have to make this about race? I mean, people are shot all the time. White people are shot, Asians. It's not just because you're black. That's what I hear all the time. And I hear it so often that I have to wonder, why am I hearing it all the time? It's because I get a lot of material. Because it happens all the time. It happens in Delaware. So I had been drawing a lot of really serious images about police brutality, so I tried to be as lighthearted as I could. So I drew this rejected postcard, Greetings from Delaware. I think you all probably remember this, where a cop can kick a black man in the face after he's surrendered and not get convicted. It happens in Chicago. to protect and to serve as judge, jury, and executioner. It happened in Ferguson. And that wasn't, I mean, there was no video. It wasn't a black and white thing. The victim wasn't the perfect victim. And so what I did was I focused on the national conversation that surrounded it. I focused on how, for instance, when, when people tried to excuse it by saying Michael Brown shouldn't have mouthed off to that cop in the first place, what black people heard was blacks should know their place. And when they said that kid was no sweet, perfect angel, what black people heard was blacks only deserve not to be gunned down like dogs if they're not sweet, if they're sweet, perfect angels. And then it happened again. You might all remember this one. A family was pulled over because they were rushing to get to the hospital because one of their mothers was about to pass away. And this is basically exactly what happened. The cops pulled them over. You weren't wearing a seatbelt. Please, we're going to the hospital. The doctor called. My mom is dying. Show us some ID. Okay. I can't see its hands. That makes me fear for my safety. We'll have to smash your window and tase you in front of these children now. Now, this is what's supposed to happen. This is what I always grew up thinking would happen. If you're in a life or death situation trying to get to see your mom at the hospital, this is what should happen. And it's probably what does happen to a lot of people, but it doesn't happen to certain people. And it goes both ways. Probably as a response to I mean, a lot of my readers who disagree with me would say that it's as a response to my cartoons, but it's whatever the provocation, people started attacking officers. And that wasn't okay, obviously. There's no excuse for that. And in response, the NYPD came out thousands of officers strong, they all in formal dress, and they had very somber ceremony and commemorating the fallen officers, which they should do. And that's the kind of thing that I wish they would do when innocent people are gunned down. I mean, they should be just as sorry for shooting people for shooting innocent people as they are as they think we should be for them being shot. And Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York, mentioned that maybe the NYPD should look into their policies, and maybe they should stop shooting so many people they don't have to shoot. And in response, everywhere he went, officers turned their backs to him. And the next time it happened, I thought about drawing a cartoon about it, and I thought, you know, I'm tired of drawing cartoons about specific issues because there's a bigger picture to look at. So I went online and I looked up incidences of police brutality, and there's a site that aggregates them all, and every day it adds more and more examples. And this is just what happened in the month of March, and I had to leave out most of what happened in March just because I didn't have space. So on Sunday, an officer punched somebody, broke their ribs, choked them for running a stop sign. The next day, someone was kneed in the torso, rupturing his spleen while in custody. The next day, someone was shot because he was mentally ill and running through the streets naked. by an officer who could have used his taser. But as happens too often, and it's inexplicable, and there are officers who, I mean, most officers probably would go for their taser, but there are some officers who their first thought is, let me get my gun. The next day, a university student, his face was bloodied for saying his zip code incorrectly. The next day, someone was slapped for asserting the right to refuse a car search. The next day, a cop choked a woman unconscious for refusing to remove her belt unless a female officer was present. Now, this one, we'll never know what happened to her. And this one I drew this morning in the hotel. Now, this one, it's one of those things that's just so tragic. I found myself laughing, and so it's just another day in America theater presents Stay Still and They Won't Shoot You. Officers, all he has is a toy truck. I'm a behavioral therapist at a group home. This is my patient. He has autism. I'm trying to calm him. All he has is a toy truck. Ronaldo, be still. Be still and the police won't shoot you. Bang. See, they didn't shoot you. Now, the saddest part about that, the most tragic part about that is I just basically transcribed what happened. I didn't have to add anything but a punchline. So, do I have to say it's about race? I mean, the answer is I shouldn't have to, because statistics show that it is, but I do.
You know, at this point, when people bring stuff up like that, who talk about, you know, do you really have to make it about race? I don't even engage with people like that anymore, because at this point, you have to quadruple your blinders to be ignorant to the fact that race has something to play in all this. And what's interesting about being back at this Satire Fest is 2 years ago I was in San Francisco. Was it in San Francisco was the Satire Fest? And I presented what was the beginning of, I talked about this slideshow that I'd be doing. And on police brutality, collected my police brutality cartoons. Basically 2 years ago when I was in, I was drawing something about Ferguson, and I came across this picture of this woman holding up a sign that said, "I can't believe I still have to protest this shit." And the look on her face was like exactly the way I felt. For 20 plus years, I've been drawing police brutality cartoons. And every time I drew one, I was like, is this the last time I'm gonna have to do this? And certainly it isn't. So I put this slideshow together, and one of the earliest times was at Satire Fest in San Francisco. And it was such a downer when I was showing this stuff that I was like, okay, I gotta throw in some humor here, because it was such a downer. But for your own well-being, it's not even worth. Anybody who sits there and says it has nothing to do with race is so in denial that it's a joke. So I'll show you what I do. I do 3 different comic strips. I do The Nightlife, which is a daily cartoon, runs in the Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, a few different places. I also do an autobiographical strip called The K Chronicles, and then I do a single panel called Think. So this is a combination of the 3. This is the cover of one of my latest books, which is basically a compilation of the stuff from the slideshow. And every time I did the slideshow, they say, do you have a book with all those cartoons? And I say, no, but now I do. And this is the firing range where police officers do target practice. How come all the targets are black? What do you mean? They're silhouettes. They're supposed to be black. I'm talking about the afro and the FUBU logo across the chest. Well, I'll be. So that thing up in his hand is a basketball, but it works as a watermelon too, so you can work it either way. So I did this in 2008. Last year, a female soldier in Florida wanted to do target practice, so she went to her local police station and said, could I shoot in your station where the police officers practice? They said, sure. So this female black soldier goes into where they shoot, and she looks at the targets. What they have for targets are photos, blown up photos of young black male teenagers. And one of them was her brother as a teenager. Now, when the police chief was interviewed about this, he said, well, it's not illegal what we're doing. That was his excuse. Now, if you think that that is sort of an isolated incident or just like some random thing where it just happened to just get caught, I mean, this is the mentality of I'm not saying it's everyone who's thinking that way, but there are police officers who have the right to kill people who are doing stuff like this. And the only time we're getting mad is when we see it. Every time we see it, every time it gets caught on camera, how often do you think it's happening not on camera? That's the question I ask. One of my most popular strips was How to Discern an Innocent Gesture from a Gang Sign. It's really subtle, so look closely. Peace. Vice City Vagrants. 3-point signal. Tri-City Bloods. Okie dokie. Oaktown Crips. Rock on, bro. West Side Ballers. Misguided Youth. And Thug. So this went viral and just went all over the place. And about 10 months later, it was really popular again, and I looked to see why, and this is what happened. This is a small town. This is a picture of the mayor of a small town outside of Minneapolis, and she was doing this cleanup, this neighborhood cleanup. And one of the people that was cleaning up was this former gang member who is now a community activist, and she took a picture with him. And you know, they took this picture, and they're pointing at each other, and the local newscast basically did the story, Mayor makes gang signs with gang member. And they interviewed the local cop, the police captain. He said, she's putting at risk every officer's life in the community. It was like this huge, crazy thing. The great thing about Twitter is they got back at it and started posting all these people making gang signs in their photographs. And this is my favorite one. So it's nice that, you know, people have a sense of humor about it, and but it's you know, it's gotten to the point now where it's really just like completely absurd how to sort of I don't know, just not justify the anger that is really is palpable, and it's happening all over the place. And there really is, after moving, I moved from Los Angeles to North Carolina, and in the past year I've learned more about sort of the history of blacks in this country than I've ever learned in any school I ever went to. I grew up in Massachusetts and lived in San Francisco, but the education I've gotten just from, you know, doing the research in the history of Durham and sort of Wilmington, like the coup in Wilmington, and just like basically the African American experience, my slideshow has morphed into this thing where like our biggest problem is we don't learn anything beyond the European American experience in this country. So people grow up and sit there and go, well, what has anybody else done except white people? That's what Representative Steve King said. Or what has anybody else done? So it's like this weird superiority complex. And anybody who isn't European American is like, wow, like what have we done? And because we don't connect what happened in the past to what's happening now, I mean, it can all be explained once you know this stuff. Everything from the disparity between the wealth of black families and white families. There was a report, like 200 years, it'll take 200 years before a black family has as much wealth as a white family. And so if you consider that in the 30s and 40s, the US government, to get everybody to buy their first house, they gave out low-cost loans. They only gave it to white people. They never gave it to any black people. And they never gave it to any white people that wanted to live near black people. So basically you had ghettos form, and black families couldn't get their first houses. This stuff gets passed down through families, and that's how you build wealth. And so when this stuff happens, it's not just because black people can't get it together. It's because at a certain time, my grandmother couldn't go to the local state college, couldn't get the education that other people had, couldn't get the jobs that other people had. I just did this slideshow in DC just last weekend, and my aunt was there. And she said she picked cotton as a kid for 43 cents a day. And my mom, if she didn't pick enough cotton, she would be beaten. And this isn't, they weren't slaves, but they certainly weren't getting paid very well. And they were certainly getting beaten if they weren't picking enough cotton. And that sort of sounds like slavery. So if we know this history, it goes on to explain a lot of what's going on today. So last couple of comics. This is my Kaepernick comic, Divided We Sit. And it's funny because so many people get bent out of shape with the rioting and the blocking traffic and holding up. And people are always like, oh, why don't you just have a peaceful protest? Well, when someone does a peaceful protest, people get bent out of shape about it too. So it doesn't matter what we do. All lives matter, asterisk, restrictions apply, see skin color for details. I'm sure you've heard this before, but the all lives matter thing, it's can be explained like this. If I have a bumper sticker on the back of my car that says, save the rainforest, it doesn't mean F all the other forests. It means rainforests are being cut down at an exorbitant rate, and we need to do something about it. So that's what Black Lives Matter is what it's all about. So, the idea that you're like, all lives matter, it's the same as you're pulling the race card. It's the same as, if you're jogging or walking for breast cancer, you don't sit there and go, all cancers matter, all cancers matter. You don't do that, The last thing I just want to leave you with is a quote from Sean King, who is a writer who's just his posts inspire me a whole lot. He said, listen, if you ever wondered what you would do if you were alive in the civil rights movement, now is the time to find out. Now, right now. And this is that moment where you sit there and, like, if you're sitting on the side and just sitting there going, oh, I'm not racist. I teach my kids not to be racist. That's not good enough. Okay, to me, it's similar to saying, like, I don't litter. I tell my kids not to litter. Well, this system that we live in, there are plenty of people littering all over the place, and we collectively have to work to clean it up. And that, to me, is extremely, extremely important. We have a system that is in place that allows police to do whatever they want, and they're not punished in a way that would make them stop, okay? Just a couple of quick ideas for solutions.
I'm gonna cut your mic off.
Okay, just a couple of things. I swear to you, if you punished cops, not only with jail time, but with taking away a portion of their pensions, like if it came down to money, you would see reform so quickly it would make your head spin. And I'm not just saying just the one cop, the cop whose precinct it comes from. If all those cops somehow got, it's the blue line, they're all a team. If each one of those team members suffered because of the mistakes, the lethal mistakes of a bad cop, they would be on them, and they would get rid of them faster than anything. So I think that's very important. I appreciate your time.
Senator?
Thanks for that great segue, because I guess I'm the system guy here. I kind of
Not
look like that
necessarily.
as a policymaker. I have to say, at least from where I sit, in my personal perspective as a policymaker, we struggle with these things a lot. And I just want to say thank you to these two guys whose work I really admire, and to others of you who bring this issue to us on the pages of our comic pages and editorial pages and on blogs and things like that for challenging our thoughts. Because as we, as policymakers, we have got to really wrestle with this a lot. We've got to deal with better educating and informing our police officers on how to handle things like this. I was reading a lot about what's happening in Charlotte the last couple of days. And one commentator said, often when people who are pulled over try to react, the cops immediately think that, we've seen reaching for the license or going back to a vehicle or something like that is running. And we've got a lot of training to do with our police officers to educate and to get them out there. We wrap it up in community policing and things like that. But the level of distrust between our residents and communities and our police, I think, is hit an all-time low. And I think that's really a very tragic thing. And our police officers are paying the price too, the two officers in New York, the shooting in Dallas. And it's tough for these police officers to go to work every day as well, not knowing. You all saw the scene in Dallas. It was a Black Lives Matter rally. You had some of the Black Lives Matter folks embracing the police officers before that assassin started shooting. But it is incumbent upon us as policymakers to do a better job working with law enforcement, to train them, to better prepare them, to be aware and conscious of a lot of the things that they're dealing with. And I thought a lot about Charlotte in these last 48 hours. And it seems to me another thing that we as policymakers have to do, and you all as observers of our society have to help us do as well, is get to the underlying issues. I look at so many of these cities. I sat down yesterday. The Guardian newspaper has this website which tracks these cop shootings and beatings on a regular basis. And there are 2 or 3 a day. And that's a scary thing to see. There have been 4 shootings just this week alone that have either killed or severely injured a black person. Just this week. We know the 2 that we've seen, Tulsa and Charlotte, but the other 2 were there as well. But the underlying issues, these cities are tinderboxes. And after one of these incidents happens, regardless of the circumstances, people are acting out. They're really protesting. What's going on in Charlotte? If you watched the coverage last night, as I did almost nonstop, we're taking opportunities. Charlotte's a city that's grown a lot. I'm not here to pick on Charlotte because it's in any of these cities. And this could happen just as easily in Durham. It could happen just as easily in Raleigh. We had a shooting back in the spring there. But when we're denying groups of people opportunities like affordable housing, when we deny them the achievement gap in schools, we deny them health care opportunities, it takes one incident before these people are going to take to the street. They're going to take to the street. And when a shooting like this, Mr. Scott in Charlotte, or the gentleman in Tulsa happens, or it's going to drive people in, and it's going to bring this whole flood of social issues that we have really got to start dealing with as a society and as policymakers. It brings that whole flood of things out, and people are very frustrated with that. We see one side of the political spectrum and the angry rallies that that guy over there in the corner has facilitated a lot this year. But we're seeing as well with African Americans in these urban settings as well, and not so urban settings. We're seeing smaller communities. Minneapolis, Ferguson, Missouri, Baton Rouge. You know, it's not the size of the city at all. Charlotte has always aspired to be a great big city, sports teams and banks and businesses and things like that. And now with the protests this week, those have rolled up into their streets as well. So there's a lot of work for us as policymakers to do. I would just say to many of you in this audience, the cartoonists, satirists, the observers of this, help us with that issue as well. Bring those issues to the fore. I know Darrin in Candorville, when Lamont's dealing with his daughter or Sea Dog, his friend or whatever, if you read the arc of those three main characters in there, there's a story about what's happening in our urban society. And you know, you don't see it in one strip, one panel, but a lot of the themes you've addressed in there. I'm a fan of Candorville. I read it every day at 6 o'clock in the morning with my coffee. But you know, you're addressing a lot of the societal things, the systemic things that we've got to get to. And you all, the cartoonists out there, have got to keep bringing those issues to us as well. I think I'll maybe stop there and see if there are questions or comments.
Okay, let me do this before we take questions. I'll give you guys, Darrin and Keith, a minute. You'll get a half minute to comment, and then we'll open it to questions.
I just want to say that the timing on my thing was exactly 10 minutes.
Really?
Yes.
Then it's Darrin's fault for taking less than 10 minutes.
I was just thinking about how I actually wanted to be a police officer the first few years of my life until I was 7. That was the first time I had a gun pulled on me. I was doing what normal kids do. I had seen Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and I was walking to the corner store to get a comic book, and I had a water gun. I was pretending I was shooting stormtroopers that were disguised as benches and the curb and stop sign. And I leaned down to fill up the water gun, and there was a police officer. And he said they'd had a call, and he wanted to know where I'm from, what I was doing there. And all I remember from that point on was the fact that he had his gun out, and he took mine, and he got in his car and he left. And after that, I wanted to be a cartoonist.
About 10 years after living in San Francisco, I was hanging up posters for my band, my rap band, and at the corner of Arguello and Fulton, and a cop zoomed up, pulled across Fulton's with his lights on in front of me. Comes out, he goes, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm hanging up posters, and I have this black stapler. I'm going to slowly put this down." And he gets on the radio and says, "We have a suspect." And I said, "What's this about?" He says, you fit the description of someone who's been robbing places in the area. I said, "Well, what's he look like?" He said, "A 6-foot-tall black male." And that's it. That's all he said. Now, at this time, I had these dreads. I had these huge dreads, like really poorly done. I looked like a black sideshow Bob. And clearly, if I had been doing it, someone would have described it that way. He looked like a black sideshow Bob. And so he's calling, and then I start seeing cop cars appearing from way up on Fulton, down Fulton, Arguello, Flash and all coming in. I was like, wow, this is like that thing that I've been writing about for so long, and now it's happening to me. And so I decided to take it all in, like from the perspective of because usually I'm looking and trying to catch the eye of the person who's like pulled over or whatever. And so I was like sitting there just like checking out everybody as they're coming by and seeing if I can catch somebody's eye, like just like, I wonder what it's like to be. And it was just so weird to catch people's eyes and sort of, I don't know if they were frightened or shocked like that, like I'm eyeing them and like you're next or whatever, you know? And, but what was really interesting was on a bus was my white roommate on a 5 Fulton bus at the top of the hill. He said he turned and looked down the hill and saw all these cops around. And he was like, oh man, there's like another black man being hassled by the police. And as it started to get closer, he realized like, hey, that's my black man. And the bus pulls up and he jumps off the bus and the bus pulls away. Dagan, who's about, this is my roommate, he's about 5'3", comes bounding across the street against traffic, screaming, what the F? Like going, what? Get the fuck away from him, like going nuts. I hope there's no kids here. But just screaming and going nuts. And the cops all turn around and they go, take it easy, buddy. Take it slow. And right there, I saw what white privilege was. Because if he had been black, if he had been brown, he would have been beaten, he would have been tasered, he would have been arrested. Like literally, just going nuts. I had to ask him to calm down. You know, it was like completely insane. But I just think about if something happened to me. It turned out that this guy who originally stopped me was a gung-ho rookie cop who left his jurisdiction, his neighborhood, to come over and be the savior. So he was just really excited to just find somebody that fit the description and stop me. But if something happened to me there, it could have been easily like, oh, this black stapler could have been mistaken as a gun. I'm sure I would have been vilified as a rapper because I was hanging up posters for my rap band. And I'm sure that marijuana would have been found in my system. And everybody in this room would have dismissed it as, well, he had it coming to him, you know? It's like, you know, we are human beings, you know? And we shouldn't have to be perfect to live. We shouldn't have to, everything has to be like this and like everything. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation, but Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy, it's the Duke freshman book. If you want to read something that will make you bawl your eyes out every 4 pages, he talks about how he got stopped by the cops. And here was a guy who went to law school and all this different stuff. And he says, you were so like nervous that you end up trying, like you do stuff that you wouldn't imagine that you'd do. You get a little nervous. And this is what's really interesting is a Massachusetts court just ruled that this one guy was justified, like black people are justified in running from the police when they get stopped because of the amount of profiling and hassle and the danger that you're in. That like they literally ruled like this week or sometime recently that like it's justified to run away from the police. That shows you how screwed up it is.
Let me stop you there.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a chance
Sorry.
to comment briefly, and then I'm going to open it up.
Yeah, listening to Darrin's story made me just flash back. We could never know this, but I would love to know what Tamir Rice was thinking in those last minutes before he was shot. He was a kid in the park playing with a gun, and your story was just made me flash back to that. And it made me think about the policies is, what we do. So many of the cases are, we stop guys for busted taillights. That was the case in North Charleston. That was the case in Minneapolis. Both of those victims were stopped for busted taillights. And I just think we need to think about decriminalizing marijuana as well. Because we're filling up our prisons with that kind of stuff. So those are just a few random thoughts.
On WUNC, the state of things, I think the police chief of Greensboro was on, and he was saying that he has instructed police not to pull people over for broken taillights and just like looking for excuses to pull people over. And I think that's a huge step into like just de-escalating, completely unnecessary stops.
If my taillight's busted and your taillight's busted, which one of us is going to get pulled?
Exactly.
Okay, let's take questions. Are you here to ask a question? Where's your license?
Yes. So thank you. Darrin, I was certain that your little testimonial was going to end with, and that's the day I decided I wanted to be a policeman. And Keith, I really love the observation about saving the forest, and to hell with all those other forests. My question is for the senator. I want to know what you think about Keith's idea that if the entire police force, or the precinct at least, shared financial responsibility when somebody messed up, if that would work. And second of all, what would the response be among your colleagues if you took such an idea to the North Carolina legislature?
Gee, if I take that idea to my colleagues in the North Carolina legislature, I don't think it would go far, obviously. Well, I don't know. I got to think about Keith's idea because we don't pay police officers enough now. I got to be honest with you, we really don't. And so I don't know. I got to think about that. It's a real challenge because starting salaries for these police officers, when you think that we do ask them to put their lives on the line every day, is really hard climb for me to do. So I don't know. I got to think about that. I appreciate the sentiment. Let me say that. I appreciate the sentiment, and we've got to find a way for that blue line to be something I think that we all share and participate in and understand better. And that's why it sounds trite. I mean, Mayor Roberts was there in Charlotte yesterday talking about the communication and things like that. But we've got to have that. The dialogue's got to get not just walk the beat, show up at things, but we've got to really have these law enforcement officers sit down in the communities and talk to the people in their community, engage in ways to understand what those guys are going through. So I'm going to put on my system hat for a minute here. But we've got to work with those officers. It's a real challenge to them to show up every day. So I don't know, man. I gotta think about it.
I hope that you name it after me if it does happen. But no. But the other thing is this, and I think cops.
The K fine.
Yeah, cops need to also cops that step forward and call it out need to be protected because there are you can look it up. Cops that do report police brutality, they're done. They're shunned. They're isolated. They're threatened. But cops need to be protected from cops. If cops on the right who call it out, and that's really one of the bravest things that a cop can do is when they see stuff that's within their own department. That's a tough call to make. But
and what's interesting is just in these last couple of days, and we saw it in Dallas, we see it in other communities. When the police chief is African American. We have an African American chief in Charlotte. The guy who shot Mr. Scott is African American. And so that's always black chief, black cop, if somehow that excuses it.
Yeah, no.
And helps explain, We've got to address that too.
It's not about white officers shooting cops. I mean, officers are blue before they're anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I will tell you this, I've been hassled in LA. I was the cop that hassled me the most was a black cop. And he was just, I've never seen so much attitude in a cop. And I was jaywalking. I'm from Boston, and that's what we do. And I even said that to him. I said, I'm sorry, I just moved here from Boston. And he said, what do you think, I'm an asshole? That's the first thing he said to me. And I didn't answer that, but,
Let me.
sorry.
Yes.
Hey, I wanted to thank you guys for coming, especially Darrin. I mean, when we set this panel up a year ago, I didn't know it would be this timely. So, but I wanted to thank you guys for
I
coming in.
did.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's like, it's Tuesday, time for a black. Now, I've got an institutional question, specifically related to, you have police departments that are spending so much money on buying military gear, militarizing the police, but very little on actual training. There was I think an NPR piece a while back. A lot of the post-academy training has been outsourced to private firms. A lot of these private firms, ex-military, these guys are coming in, and the entire lesson is they want to kill you. You got to shoot them first. So it's this attitude issue. But the other thing is, I mean, just like football players, cops are getting bigger and bigger. And I know someone who works with police and say, yeah, a lot of these guys, they're taking steroids. They're pumping up because they feel that they need to keep up. I mean, would you be would you be for drug testing for police, not for illicit substances, but for steroids? Roid rage is a real thing.
I guess that was addressed at me.
Yeah, that was more of an institutional question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for that. I think the militarization of our police forces is really kind of scary. Before I went to the legislature, I sat on the Durham City Council for 7 years, and I'd see the equipment we were buying. And then just watching the Charlotte cops last night marching in unison with the face shields, the shields in front of them, and taking their batons and tapping the shields as they marched, it felt very militaristic. I mean, I thought I was watching Game of Thrones and not the live news. So it's really scary, and I think that's part of the policy we've got to address. When we go to war in Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever, we call it nation building, right? I mean, that's what we talk about in the military. But we don't take that philosophy with our police officers. We're not nation building our own nation.
One addendum. 3 years ago in Durham, when there was the shooting with Chewy, and there were some protests and rioting in the streets, a newspaper photographer that I worked with, he was shooting the incident. He knew some of the policemen, and he had overheard one of them saying, "Oh, glad we got to test out this new riot gear." They just saw it as, hey, we have it, we may as well use it.
Yeah, and I think you see that with the tank-like vehicles that police departments insist they have to have now, and things like that. But then, as soon as you have a shooting in Dallas or Baton Rouge or New York, I mean, these guys feel under siege, like they need protection too. No easy answers there, but I understand the sentiment.
Just a comment about that, the idea that police get the leftover police equipment. Yeah, in order for them to continue to get it, they have to use it. Like, that's one of the requirements. That's why they break out that stuff. But to me, what happened in Dallas and happened in Baton Rouge, the fact that those guys were military, ex-military, does not surprise me. Because
the shooters,
the shooters, because they go overseas and they're told that you're killing people to give people freedom. Give people freedom, and this harkens back to World War II and Black World War II veterans. They went overseas to fight to give freedom to people, and then they came back and did not. They experienced segregation and mistreatment, and it's like those guys go overseas, they come back here, and they see what's going on with police and stuff, and they don't see justice. And in their heads, they're saying, like, I was taught that, I am fighting for freedom that I experience. And so when they come back here and don't see the freedom that they're supposedly experiencing, I think something in them says, well, I know how to solve that. I don't know if you've looked into a couple of these shooters about what they had to say on their videos and stuff, but it was just like, oh, protesting's not enough, I have to do more, and I think it harkens back to what they learned in the military. And I think that it's terrible, it's the worst case scenario, but if we don't put in jail, and it shouldn't have to be, video shouldn't have to be relied upon. I'm glad that there's cameras everywhere, but we need to be as transparent as possible. Like, these guys in Charlotte need to release the video so we can at least, because right now it just looks like they're trying to figure out, like, the fact that you say there's a gun, he could be legally carrying a gun, but if he's not pointing it at anybody, if he just has a gun on him, he shouldn't be killed. You know, that's not, if he had pulled a gun and they said drop it and he doesn't drop it, that makes sense to me. But the idea that they're not showing any video, but this the fact that we have to continually rely on the video to show it, and 9 times out of the 10, they get away with it anyway. It's just completely frustrating. And at this point, I don't expect justice to come out of anything. And I think as a person who's optimistic, like if you lose me, if I don't think justice is going to be served, you're losing probably most of the people here. I'm a happy guy.
Just before we came out, the senator said that there may be some question now whether there was a gun at all in the Charlotte shooting. And if it turns out that that's the case, that there in fact was not a gun, I think the police and the mayor have done a great disservice to Charlotte. And I'm from Charlotte, my family lives there, and I would expect that they'll have much, much larger demonstrations, much more violent, if it turns out that they've been lying about it. They've stated unequivocally that he had a gun. If it turns out he didn't have a gun, I think they lose credibility, probably in their careers, I would expect.
Yeah, on the way over, and perhaps some of you on your smartphones, news feeds, heard what I did on the way in and was checking on my phone before we came out. But in the press conference today, Chief Putney said that it wasn't clear that he had a gun. And in yesterday's presser, he was somewhat emphatic. Yeah.
Really? Because every time I heard him before that, he was saying there was a gun. Like, we don't know anything right now, but he had a gun, not a book.
Had a gun, no book. Right.
Yeah, and you can, every time this happens, you can see systemically what they do is they vilify the victim and they praise the cop. Like, they say the cops, you know, this, like, family, wonderful, this, that, and then they say the victim, you know, had a record, you know, this, that. Like, I can almost expect to see what they're gonna do. Just like, okay, here's when they start, you know, saying some bad stuff for what he might be doing, or, oh, he's got a kid out of a wedlock. Oh, he's, you know, dropped out of high school, you know, stuff like that. And it's just, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, you know?
Let me call him.
Hi, I'm from Arizona and a former fully sworn cop. My colleagues used to call me a cartoonist when I was on working the street with them. But a couple of really brief examples of the problems that I saw on the street with police officers that I don't think they consciously thought about. One had to do with our training, post-academy training. We had a class on racial sensitivity, and the class was taught by a white officer to an overwhelmingly white force. And the teacher was saying, let me help you understand the different racial groups. Black people tend to gesticulate a lot and talk loud, which was stereotyping in and of itself. Another time I was on the street and one of my colleagues came across the radio and he had been called out to a situation where a resident was making strange, displaying strange activities in the neighborhood. And the dispatcher said, what are the strange activities and what's the description of the subject? It's a black man and he's waving at people. And the officer who was dispatched to the call refused to take the call, 1024 number 0, which was good But I think he should have taken a step further. He had the opportunity to respond to the call because it's a call for service. And he should have taken that opportunity to explain to the white resident that this is inappropriate racial classification and stereotyping, so it works on both ends. I think cops need to be proactive in teaching racial sensitivity to residents, and our instructors in post-academy training need to be aware of unconscious racial stereotyping as they teach. And if you'd like to just comment on those two general principles, but I saw it in my own experience as a cop.
Both great suggestions, and yeah, I mean, I think and I guess one of the things I would advocate is more training after the academy. I know in this community, Durham, we require twice the number of hours of our police officers that other police forces in North Carolina require. So that means that an officer who aspires to be on our police force is accepted and goes through the training, goes through twice the amount of training as in neighboring communities. That's just the Durham way we've done it here in Durham. But we've got to do a lot more once they leave the academy. We have to expose them to a lot more thought, ways of thinking, ways of doing things. So, yeah, great suggestions.
I would just say this, that I think we either have to change the name of racist sensitivity training or because I just know that from my experience talking to cops that they have to take it, but it's not really that effective. It's like, pulling teeth with them. I think it's important, but I think you have to do it in a different way. And one of the greatest classes that I'd ever been a part of was I did this slideshow at the University of Delaware, and they had a class that's just called race. And I came in and sat in on it and talked a little bit about it, but I walked out of there thinking like, this is the most important class that I think should be in every high school and every college in America, that just talked about historically, just from different perspectives, and the importance of diversity and the idea that what white privilege was, because it's tough to explain it to a lot of people, because it's like telling a fish, how's the water, and the fish is like, what are you talking about? What water? Like they had so many different exercises that they went through, and these discussions were great. Unfortunately, there was one white male out of everybody in the class. It was mostly women. There were about 4 guys, and there was one white guy in it. And but it was like I was like, oh my God, this class is amazing. It was really cool, but. It's one of those classes that I think should be in every school.
But I think there should be. That's a good idea. That the officer should respond to the call. I think there should be repercussions for people who call 911 when somebody's doing something normal, and it leads to somebody's death. I think people should, even if the repercussion is only that they have to sit there and listen to a police officer tell them that they're responsible for what happened.
It should be more than that, but I think there's a case like that in LA. Where,
there?
There was a guy who was shot, who was, someone called in and said that this guy had taken something and he wound up being shot and killed by the police. But even the dude who was in the Walmart, who was walking around with a toy gun on the phone with his mom, someone called and said, there's a black man here aiming guns at people, And even Tamir Rice, the guy called in, but he said it's probably a toy.
Right.
But the thing about Tamir Rice, if you read the history of that cop, there were a bunch of police departments that would not take that guy because he was a mess with a gun, and the fact that this guy was able to still get a job, and then just that. That goes to the top to hire that guy. That's the problem with leadership.
Yes. What time are we supposed to end? Okay, I just want to make sure. Yes.
Thank you. I think one thing that Keith and Darrin and Mr. Woodard have been talking about is this is a deep problem, and the police violence is sort of a symptom of something far deeper. And, you know, Keith talks about the history of the country. He mentioned the coup in Wilmington. This goes back as far as Reconstruction, in which systems were made to deter blacks and whites from working together. And the sense you get is that training can be done, but unless something is done at a far deeper level and nationwide, it really seems to be the problem is that in the police departments are, as far as I understand, are almost entirely parochial institutions. City by city, they make their own rules, town by town, and there may be some county or state jurisdiction as well, but there's no, as far as I understand, there aren't many national rules for establishing these are what the police are supposed to do. And it seems as though, as a matter of like literally public health, that would seem to be something that makes sense. But instead, we don't. And I also wonder, in terms of the sort of people who enter the police academy, I wonder how much screening is done of someone's background, of someone's attitudes. And if someone hasn't gone to high school in a diverse area or hasn't had this class, you know, on race, what attitudes are they already bringing in to their profession, and how much of that is going to affect their job, especially if they view someone of a different race automatically as an adversarial, adversarial person. You know, that this is the way they were raised, this is the way they're meant to think, and it would seem that putting better restrictions on the sort of people who are allowed to become police officers would seem to make sense. And I think the last point and the most critical point right now is they talk about, you know, the blue code, the blue line, the blue line of silence, and this sort of like, you know, having a lot of blowback against those who violate it is such a bizarre, tribal, and almost criminal attitude. Because it's like, you know, who else do you hear about having a code of silence? You hear about criminal organizations. So the fact that the reaction to this, any kind of criticism by the police is almost a threat to like, if you don't like us, we'll quit and there'll be no cops. And how do you like that then? This kind of like almost overlying threat of you need us and don't criticize what we do if you know what's good for you is really the overlying perspective of this. And I was just wondering kind of each of your perspectives and also Mr. Woodard's in general, sort of, you say you struggle with this at a government level, you know, how many of these ideas, concepts have you talked about with your colleagues? And certainly in this state, I know it's very difficult, but certainly within the city, I wonder how much of that you discuss. Thanks.
I'll react to the first part, or well, it's to your point. It's a department by department kind of thing. I mean, you know, sheriffs in North Carolina and in many other states are elected officials. So they're responsible to the voters. Joe Arpaia in Arizona is elected. So, you know, when he says the crazy stuff he says and the immigration policies and, you know, having his prisoners wear pink jumpsuits and the way he humiliates the people, you know, in his custody, he keeps getting reelected by big margins. So in North Carolina, there are 100 different sheriffs. And as we've talked about how we handle body cams, which is an issue that's gotten a lot of attention, obviously, in the last 48 hours, you know, we've had to look at we've tried to implement we have implemented a state policy that takes effect here in the next few days that Charlotte's having to react to. But it's because we had 100 different sheriffs who could interpret the law 100 different ways. 500 municipalities in North Carolina, of those, I think about 250 have their own police force. And again, a police chief who reports to a city manager, who then reports to a city council. Again, and we're seeing that play out now in Charlotte with Chief Putney, who reports to a city manager, who I haven't seen standing there with the mayor and council, but how he interprets it. So yeah, it's going to be at that local municipal level, so it's a lot harder to implement that. We've tried with some of the things that come out of Raleigh, and the law we had was quite a compromise, I will say, and you all have heard a lot about that, and we'll hear a lot about that in the coming weeks in the aftermath of the Charlotte shooting. But there were 170 legislators in Raleigh, and you've got 170 different opinions about what we should do. So us reaching consensus was near impossible. So what we came with was what Charlotte's having to think about and deal with, as well as all of these other 300 plus law enforcement departments. I'm not sure I'm getting to your question, but what was the last part of it?
Why don't we
Okay.
stop there, and then this is going to be the last question. Sorry, but yes.
Thanks. I was wondering, we're talking about police, none of which, except for Sergeant Benson over there, have had actual police experience. What is your experience with journalism and journalists and race issues and coverage, and even cartoonists? I would say you too, if I may. And I'm profiling because you're cartoonists.
Well, my experience with it, I think cartoonists have always been pretty good at identifying the problem and commenting on it. There aren't enough, and they're usually homogenous. They're usually, I think if there's a failing, a lot of them are superficial because they don't have any skin in the game. I think a lot of them don't have the same perspective. They have an altruistic perspective, but they don't have a perspective of someone who it's happened to them. And I think we need more of that.
My experience as a cartoonist, as a black cartoonist, when I first started out, the only time I would get work is in February. And and so I would I would get the work done on time. I would, make sure I got my check, but then I would say, hey, I'm busy the other 11 months of the year. But I think the newspaper industry's failings is how backwards they are. I think they're 50 years behind. I think my experience, since I came after you, is when my strip, they're trying to sell my strip, it's like, oh, we already have Candorville. We already have a black cartoonist. It's like we're just looked upon as like, the same. And that drives me crazy. And even in the alternative weekly market.
I should just point out, a few years ago, there were maybe 12 syndicated black and brown cartoonists. And I organized this day of protest where we all basically drew the same strip, just with our own characters, to point out how the papers think that we're all interchangeable. And the strip was totally out of character for a lot of the strips. And I think it pointed out the fact that we're not just black strips, we're, the characters are black. But the strips, they're very diverse. And for a few months, papers added maybe a third black strip, and then they started dropping them again. And I think the number is gone down to like 6 or 7 in the papers. And I feel like we took like 1 step forward and 3 steps back.
Yeah, definitely. And you see strips that are running where the creator died like 50 years ago. And like, you know, just people are just running those strips. If newspapers were interested in gaining readerships, you know, you would think they would add newer strips. Plus, I think they're cheaper, right? If you get new strips. But I like even the alternative weekly market. I had a guy come up to me and said, well, I love your strip, a white guy. I love your strip, but we don't have any black people in our town, so I'm not going to rent it. And I literally, I said to the guy, I said, wait a second, like, well, you're white, right? Like, and you love my strip? And he's like, yep. He literally said that people aren't open-minded. His readers aren't open-minded.
Yeah.
You know, here was this guy who loves it, and he's like the most closed-minded individual. It's just like, because I think editors think they think their readers are morons.
Yeah, they do. They really underestimate the readership. At every book signing I've ever done, I have like a line of white people waiting to tell me that they come up, like I hear this all the time, I'm probably not your typical reader.
Yeah, I know. My typical reader is the 53-year-old white man. And he announces that whenever I get a letter. It's always like, I'm a 53-year-old white man. And I can't believe that my favorite strip is from an African-American male. I say, well, Star Wars is my favorite movie. It's done by a 53-year-old white male. I can't believe that's my favorite movie. And then they never write to me again. But it's, you know, it really is sort of just, it's the gatekeepers that are really the issue, because you can connect with anybody, and we all have more similarities than differences, but it's the gatekeepers that are kind of preventing it. But that's the great thing about the internet, because we don't need stinking newspapers anymore. I'm sorry, who's here from the newspaper?
Okay, and with that, we're going to end it.
Cheers.